Hi folks, this is Dr. Fowler, and in each week I'd like to add a short video addendum to sort of just expand on what the forum discussion is for that week. This week we're talking about the history of terrorism, and so I'd like to expand on that a little bit from what's in your text or what I will post in the forum once all the forum responses are in place. So we need to think about terrorism as it applies to history. Terrorism is not a new phenomenon. Terrorism has been around at least since people have been living in groups, and probably since Cain killed Abel in the Bible. It's a very, very old concept. The second thing to remember is that terrorism, while in the modern world we often emphasize the role of technology in terrorism, terrorism is, at its core, always human motivated. So since human motivations have not changed over time, neither have the motivations for terrorism. Technology certainly plays a role in how those motivations are realized and the extent to which terrorism ideas can be distributed around the world. And of course we see that in the World Wide Web, for example. So those are things to consider. When we talk about terrorism, we often hear the terminology asymmetric warfare, and in looking at some of the writings that people have done since 9/11, it almost sounds like, you know, they've discovered asymmetric warfare. Well, I will submit to you that people who fought wars in the Bronze Age, although they wouldn't have called what they were doing asymmetric warfare, they would have been very used to that sort of conflict. It is one of the ways in which warfare was carried out even in antiquity. So we should keep that in mind. Also, we need to remember that terrorism is conducted for a variety of reasons. You know, in some cases, an oppressed minority may find that the only avenue they have left to fight a repressive regime is terrorism. Now, of course, there are some people that will probably find issue with that, but you know, you can actually make a pretty good argument that terrorism was used even during the American Revolution to some extent, on both sides. So that is something to consider. When we talk about terrorism, we also want to remember that it's global in nature. You know, it has occurred in the eastern parts of the world and in the western parts of the world. There's nothing unusual about that, and that ties back into what we said about it being people motivated. So that's something we need to remember. One of the things that I often see in the discussion in this class for the Week 1 forum is that many people tend to be very ethnocentric. That is, we tend to look at these constructs that we examine in this class through American eyes. It's very ethnocentrically viewed. I would like for you not to do that. And so what I often see in the forum are things from 9/11 on, or things that only affect America. One of the purposes of this forum is to break you out of that mold and have you examine terrorism from a more global perspective. So I want you to do that in this class. Please consider that very carefully when you are framing answers to some of the questions in the forums. The only other thing that I would really like to emphasize on terrorism, once again, is that not only is terrorism very old, but so are means of fighting terrorism. For example, if you study Roman history, you will find that the Romans were conducting what we might consider special ops missions across the Rhine into tribal areas of Germany, even back in the time of the Roman Empire. After the Claudian invasion of 43 AD in Britain, the British war leader Caractacus fought a very masterful fighting withdrawal into what is now Wales and the western part of the British Isles. And he did that using insurgent type warfare after facing the Romans in open battle and making a very very good decision not to do that again. So these are things that we need to consider when we think about terrorism. Terrorism is a very broad subject. We will certainly talk about terrorism both as it applies to military operations today. We'll talk about domestic terrorism, and we'll talk about global terrorism. So we'll talk about both those elements. If you consider domestic terrorism, there are some things we'll probably discuss later on in the class about that as to what constitutes domestic terrorism. For example, one of the things you might want to think about is that, for example, with the Boston Marathon bombing, was that really domestic terrorism? From the standpoint of it having occurred here, I would say yes. However, the motivations for those acts, or that act, was motivated by events in faraway Chechnya and the Russian Federation. So, so many of these things we'll examine in detail. There's not always a cut and dried answer to things. Terrorism is a complex issue, and so I think as we go through the course, one of the goals must be to provide you with a framework within which to analyze terrorism and to apply it to your operational needs if you're in the business of fighting terrorism. So I welcome questions. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the classroom.